me out with some literary theory discussions. With that, I'll get started. So, Paulo Freire was an educational theorist who cut his teeth developing literacy programs for Brazilian field workers. As he worked on these literacy programs, he noticed a problem with many educational practices. They were a central element in preserving oppressive status quos. For Freire, oppression relies on, among other things, a prescriptive relation where the oppressor dictates actions and behaviors for the oppressed to passively follow. One of the reasons educational processes preserve oppressive status quos is that they tend to rely on this prescriptive relation. As students internalize this prescriptive relation, they prepare themselves for a life of mindless rule following. Part of the remedy for this problem involves a fairly straightforward solution. Transform the student-teacher relation from one where the active teacher teaches and the passive teaches the passive students to one where the teacher is also a student and the students are also teachers. This is commonly referred to as the problem-posing model of education, where all people, teacher and students, work together to make sense of and solve complex topical problems. Last semester, I was teaching this section of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed when a student asked an interesting question. From a Freirian standpoint, are books oppressive? I believe the question considered the unilateral relation between reader and author in terms of the prescriptive relation between oppressor and oppressed. While my gut reaction was to say no, I couldn't immediately think of a Freirian response that wouldn't run down the road of hypocrisy. This struck me as odd because, one, Freire saw developing the ability to read, the point to his literacy projects, as essential to ending oppression. And two, Freire wrote a book with the goal of working to end oppression. So from a Freirian standpoint, the answer wants to be no, but the question is whether the answer actually can be no. My confusion lasted until I sat down with my 3-year-old son to watch his favorite TV show, Super Why. In Super Why, a group of fairy tale characters go into storybook land to solve real-life problems. While the idea of using fiction to help make sense of reality is nothing new, I do find Super Why's approach quite novel. They don't merely adapt the storybook lesson to their real-life problem. They use the lesson as a practice arena for understanding, transforming, and solving their problems. Essential to this paper is the relevance of transformation to non-oppressive environments. Super Why and his team change the parts of the story they don't like, and in this interactive model of reading, learn to transform the world. In this paper, I argue that the literary move found in Super Why serves as an essential interpretive framework for understanding Paulo Freire's literacy projects. I will show this in 3 stages. First, I'll provide a bit more background to help us understand Freire's project. Next, I will identify the challenge we are confronted with when considering the written word in relation to Freire's concept of oppression and begin working towards a resolution. Finally, we'll turn our attention to Super Why and consider how this cartoon epitomizes the literary framework needed for understanding and resolving the challenge my students' question posed. With this outline in place, let us now begin with the first section, a bit of background for Freire. So, part 1, understanding Freire, his concept of humanity. In a book titled Pedagogy of Freedom, Freire says, "I like being human because I know that my passing through this world is not predetermined or pre-established, that my destiny is not a given, but something that needs to be constructed and for which I must assume responsibility. I like being human because I am involved with others in making history out of possibility, not simply resigned to fatalistic stagnation." For Freire, taking responsibility involves an awareness of the interactive role we play in the world. Bears find caves to live in, but humans, we think of ways to construct a home, we draw up blueprints, and then we build the home. We ship water into deserts to make them habitable, and we create heat in snowy environments to make living in them without large deposits of fat or fur tolerable. In short, we mold our world to suit our needs. We do not just adjust ourselves to the world around us, we transform it as well. While we share our adaptive capacities with other animals, the ability to intentionally transform our world and recognize this transformative ability marks a fundamentally human characteristic. Freire calls this relation to our world integrative. Integration results from the capacity to adapt oneself to reality, plus the capacity to make choices and transform that reality. These 2 capacities, adaptation and transformation, are fundamental cooperating parts of the human life. Next part, oppression. So oppression occurs when humans lose the ability to recognize their integrative capacities in the world. The adaptive and transformative processes of integration are reduced to the merely adaptive. To the extent that, quote, man loses his ability to make choices and is subjected to the choices of others, to the extent that his decisions are no longer his own because they result from external prescriptions, he is no longer integrated. Rather, he is adapted, he is adjusted. Oppression, then, involves a rupture of the integrative capacities in such a way that the oppressed no longer recognize themselves as transformative beings. In these situations, the oppressed recognize others as transformative and themselves as adaptive. Oppressors establish the framework from which the oppressed are to operate, and the oppressed adapt themselves to it. Next part, oppression in education. For Freire, institutionalized education plays a special role in the oppressive framework because it, in many instances, functions as oppression's reproductive mechanism. In short, institutionalized education gets students comfortable with the prescriptive elements of oppression. The students are taught to follow rules and subordinate their own intellectual capacities to those of others. The influence of oppression on the educational structure is most clearly seen in what Freire refers to as the banking model of education, a model where students act like banks waiting to be filled with the teacher's deposits of knowledge. The teacher prepares a lesson, thinks about the best possible way the lesson can be understood by the students, and then delivers a lesson while adjusting for times when the students fail to properly grasp the materials. The goal of the class is, by the end of the semester, for the teacher to have created a group of students whose knowledge matches, or is at least closer to matching, a certain aspect of the teacher's knowledge. The students are trained into a fundamental adaptivity. Their educational process constantly reinforces the idea that they have to adapt to the thoughts and will of those in power. In this situation, a feedback loop occurs between institutionalized education and oppression. Education, as described above, is fed on the idea of a fixed, static world where power differentials exist between the active, dictating participants, or the teachers, and the passive, receiving recipients, or the students. There are those who know and those who work to memorize what is already known, those who direct and those who patiently await directions. While this type of environment might be able to create punctual, rule-following, adapted, in some ways productive employees, Freire would argue that it is not a suitable environment for creating active citizens who participate in a democratic society. The design person who worked on the poster, one of the poster ideas he had worked out was basically a classroom environment where a teacher's standing at a podium like this, and then all the students would be mirrors, and the mirrors are reflecting the teachers. And I think that's getting at what Freire sees as the problem with the educational model, is that we're creating mini us's and not developing the student as an independent person. So the solution. Freire finds a solution to oppressive models of education in what is often called problem-posing education. The teacher neither tells the students how to solve the problem, nor guides the students through the steps of its solution. Instead, the teacher acts as a co-investigator into the problem. This Freirian model of education is built on the recognition of the integrative capacities for all of the people involved in the educational process. Teacher and students all adapt to and transformatively contribute to each other's understanding of the world, with the final goal of, when appropriate, transforming the world itself. Everybody involved is recognized as contributing in an essential way to an understanding of the problems posed in the educational setting. This is most clearly explained in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Quote, "Through dialogue, the teacher of the students and students of the teacher cease to exist, and a new term emerges, teacher-student with students-teachers. The teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself taught in dialogue with the students, who in turn, while being taught, also teach. They become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow. In this process, arguments based on authority are no longer valid. In order to function, authority must be on the side of freedom, not against it. Hence, no one teaches another, nor is anyone self-taught." In this model, education is empowering because the teachers engage students in a meaningful dialogue oriented toward a fuller understanding of and transformation of our world by all people. The Freirian mindset then acknowledges a twofold function of the educational environment. One, figuring out how the world works, and two, practicing, when needed, changing our world. Part 2, working on the student's question within a Freirian context. With the above Freirian model in mind, we are now in a position to see the insight driving the student's question that was mentioned in the beginning of this paper. Are books oppressive? To understand the insight driving this question, let's first turn our attention to some basic ideas about reading. First, readers rarely interact with the authors they read. The reader and author are mediated by way of the written word, but the mediation is unusual in that the author has no or little connection to the reader. The reader has the artifact of the author's work, but the author has virtually nothing of the reader as individual. This makes the relation between author and reader unilateral. The two are not working on a problem together. The author has nothing left on the book to work on, with the rare exception of revisions that occur when new editions are released. Once the work reaches the reader's hand, the goal is to understand the author's product. Outside of English departments, one usually does this by trying to figure out the author's intent. For example, if I'm reading a work by Plato, my job is to figure out what Plato meant when discussing the theory of the forms. Is he talking about mere definitions, or is he talking about some actually existing object in some quasi-spiritual realm? I might read some commentary on Plato's work or look in some other of his written works to figure out what he means in this particular section. My task then as reader is to figure out what the author meant when the author wrote whatever it is that I am reading. The goal of reading a book is the same as the goal of a student in Freire's banking model of education: to absorb something new from one's unilateral relation with the author in a way that's mediated by the text. And this, I believe, is the problem the student was getting at. There seems to be a prescriptive relation between author and reader mediated by the text, similar to the prescriptive relation between teacher and student in the banking model of education. Other theories will, of course, problematize the above described interaction between author and reader in relation to meaning. Take, for example, Roland Barthes' Death of the Author. For Barthes, both author and text are born together. The author does not first exist as a parent who then creates the text. It is in the very creation of the text that the author is co-born. As such, the author is a mere sibling to the text who has no rights to predetermined meaning. In this context, the reader takes an active role in the interpretation of the work. Even if the author protests the meaning found by the reader, the protest is irrelevant. Meaning is no longer found in the intentions of the author. It is now found exclusively in the script. Furthermore, there are multiple meanings to be found depending on the multiple readers of the text. Take, for instance, The Little Engine That Could, a children's story about a train that breaks down, who is not sure of her abilities, and another one who comes to help, is not sure of her abilities, but decides to help. I think I can is the rallying cry of the little engine who could help. While the author probably intended nothing more than to write a story about perseverance in the face of difficulty, the text nonetheless contains a plurality of meanings independent of the author's intent. From a feminist point of view, the book might be a sexist relegation of the female to a helpless and domestic role. The train that breaks down is female train, transporting domestic supplies like groceries and toys. She desperately searches for help from all of the passing male trains, but they all have much more important, or at least financially productive, work to do. However, these various sexist images in the book also come into conflict with a potentially non-sexist move. The hero of the story is the only other female train in the story, thus revealing that women are in fact capable of solving their own problems. From a Marxist point of view, we might read this story as a tale of dehumanization in the face of alienated material production. All of the trains who pass the broken engine claim that they have more important things to do, like move people, coal, paper, or other valuable resources for industrial production. In the name of mass industry, they all overlook the singular individual in need. They sacrifice the human on the altar of economy. And from my son's point of view, it is a story about trains, and trains are awesome. The distinction between these models, authorial intent and death of the author, relies on at least 4 aspects of the written word. First, there is a writer. Second, there are actual words on paper. Third, there is a reader. And fourth, there is meaning. According to authorial intent, the writer possesses meaning and transmits it to the reader. Text is the means of that transmission. For death of the author, meaning emerges in relation to the text itself and or in relation to the reader. Either way, it emerges independent of the writer's intent. A further contrast can be noted when one considers the relation between writer and text. For authorial intent, the author controls every aspect of the text. For death of the author, the text speaks through the author. To make this idea clear, Barth refers to the author as scripter, a person who does not write one's own ideas, but the ideas of another. So while both positions consider the author or scripter as the one who physically manipulates the text by putting pen to paper, they disagree about what this physical manipulation means. This divergence of death of the author from authorial intent relies on a shattering of the concept of the author. However, it is not until we consider the function of the palimpsest that we can fully turn our attention to a second shattering, the concept of the reader. A palimpsest is a text that has been written over a previously erased text. In the past, this was done for various reasons, quite often to stretch a thin resource, paper. Some would find a text no longer needed, erase it, and write a new one over the top. So here's an example of a classic palimpsest. You have the text there. You can see the old text is kind of buried in the background. The black writing is written right over the top, and so it's just a reusing of the paper. This happens with art and architecture as well. Infrared technology has revealed many palimpsests in the art world. To save canvas, an artist would take an old painting and paint a new one over the top. The city of Seattle that you can visit today was literally built over the top of the old city. In Greece, you see the modern city written over the ancient ruins. While these palimpsests were probably not trying to make points about the relation between overlapping instantiations of meaning, others do push in this direction. Take, for example, this painting by Duchamp. Duchamp takes the original text or painting of the Mona Lisa, overlays a mustache and goatee, and adds a title. So if you look up in there, you'll see a mustache and a goatee on the Mona Lisa, and then that LHOOQ, which depending on if you're reading those letters from French or English will have different connotations. So there's that painting. This transformation of the text, the Mona Lisa, institutes new meanings not previously occurring in the Da Vinci version of the painting. With this, the viewer or reader of the Mona Lisa, Duchamp, has, in transforming the text or painting, transformed himself as well into an author or co-author, or more precisely, co-scripter. DJ Danger Mouse did a similar move in creating the Grey Album. Intertwining the Beatles' White Album with Jay-Z's Black Album creates a new third text with new meanings, not previously accessible to the original and separate albums. In these instances, the boundary between reader and writer blurs into a single reader-writer or writer-reader. To read in these instances is to write, or more specifically, overwrite. To read, then, is to take the already written physical text itself as the medium upon which to write. For the contemporary palimpsest, the reader recognizes oneself as participating in the recreation, not mere deciphering of the text. The reader then recreates the text by reading with a pen. The palimpsest does not merely reconstitute the meanings of the text. The palimpsest reconstitutes the very text from which meaning emerges. Similarly, for Freire, to transform an impressive environment is to participate in the recreating, not mere redeciphering or deciphering of the world. The Freirian classroom is the practice arena for this task. By creating and recreating ideas, and by collaboratively contributing to the world of knowledge, students practice engaging in their world in an active, transformative manner. To bring all of these ideas together, the Freirian goals in education, the death of the author, the function of the palimpsest, let us now turn our attention to a case of palimpsism par excellence, Super Y. Part 3, Super Y, is an interpretive framework for resolving the challenge Freire's theory faces. Super Why is a cartoon that separates between real characters, Wyatt Beanstalk and his friends, and fictitious characters, the people they meet when they fly into storybook land. Each episode starts with a real-life preschool problem, like somebody's being mean, somebody's afraid, or somebody forgot to pack a snack. Once the real-life characters recognize there is a problem, too big to handle, they transform into superheroes and fly into the fictitious storybook land. While in storybook land, they tackle various challenges like letter recognition, vocabulary, and spelling exercises. It's a cartoon for 3 to 6 year olds. And recognizing the parallel between the fictitious world and their real life problems. The goal of each episode is to identify the relevant features of storybook land that teach Wyatt and his friends how to address their real life problems. In short, the storybook world teaches Wyatt and his friends how to deal with the real world. The storybook serves as the source of meaning for readers to understand. However, there's more to the story. Super Why doesn't just seek out new meaning in the text, he also transforms it, creating a palimpsest. In the episode titled Rolling Rice Cakes and Other Stories, George and the Dragon, the story says that a dragon scares George. So there's the dragon scaring George. That's the story they're reading, and so the cartoon characters would be three-dimensional cartoon characters that you would take as the real characters, but now they're in superhero guise, and they're reading this story. Super Why and his team try exchanging the word dragon for something that might be less scary, the word donut. So now a donut scares George instead. So there they swapped out the word dragon with the word donut. That's Super Why in the top left. The problem with this exchange, however, is that so long as George is scared, it doesn't matter what donut or dragon is scaring him. So now you have a donut that's chasing down and attacking George, and he's still scared. The super readers need a different type of change. They rewrite the story again so that now George scares the dragon. So you have the dragon scares George, and they swap it out, so now George scares the dragon. This works pretty well. Having rewrote the story twice, it is clear that the super readers are not merely observing a fixed story. They are active agents who participate in rewriting the text. They eventually decide the best fix would be for George to bravely and firmly tell the dragon what George needs it to do. What we see here is a thoroughly interactive way of engaging the text. The story is written in a multilateral fashion. The text is initially written by an author, but the reader engages the text with a pen. The reader does not just absorb whatever the author wrote, the reader actually transforms the text. In a truly Freirian move, the book is used as a practice arena for real-life change. Authentic reading, from a super Wysian perspective, is involved in a continual creation and recreation of the palimpsest. The written word takes on new meanings each time, as the reader understands and then transforms its very composition. With Super Why serving as an interpretive framework, we are now in a position to fully address the student's question. Do books serve to facilitate oppression in the same way the banking model of education facilitates oppression? When approached from a Super Wysian perspective, I believe the answer is no. Furthermore, from this perspective, I believe that books might have an even stronger anti-oppressive component than the Freirian classroom interaction. Books provide a somewhat ideal practice arena for anti-oppressive activities for a few reasons. First, in real-life interactions, variables constantly change. How many times have we heard someone say, "I didn't say that," or "hurry up, we haven't got all day"? In a book, what was written by the original author remains static and fixed. If there is uncertainty about what was said, one need merely flip back the page. Also, if the reader needs more time to think over the meaning and possible responses, the reader has that time. There is no interlocutor pressing for time like there is in a conversation. This gives the reader the chance to slowly understand and evaluate what was said. If needed, the reader can sleep on a thought. Finally, the reader has a chance to play with responses in a low-pressure environment. There is no interlocutor pressing the reader to interpret the text in a certain way. Finally, this allows for the reader to, when needed, rewrite the text again and again, looking for a satisfactory or better yet, co-creation of the story. No longer is the reader merely a reader. The reader is also a co-author. In the same way the Superwisian approach to books allows for the reader to understand and co-author the text, the Freirian approach to the classroom allows for the student to understand and co-author the classroom. Both of these approaches work toward the final goal of developing the previously mentioned integrative capacities of the human, adapting to and transforming our world. While this answer comes a semester too late, I can now say to that student that no, books are not oppressive in the way the banking model of education is oppressive, so long as one operates within the Superwisian framework. While this provides a resolution to the question at hand, it presses a second question that, while essential, cannot be addressed within the time constraints of this talk. Is this Superwisian framework merely one of many models for reading, or is it in fact the very description of what it is to authentically read? And that's all I got. Sure. Any questions, comments? What's that?
So do they really have a choice?
Oh, so that's right. So the task for the people in this room was to interpret a dialogue that happened between us. And the dialogue was, from one teacher to another, do you want the students to take notes? And my response was, I want the students to do what they want to do in this situation. And the teacher said, they have no say in this. You tell them what to do. And your task was to interpret that dialogue. Any takers on that interpretation? From whose from your perspective?
Well, wouldn't it be oppressive simply just to, if you're going off the banking model, right?
Oh, hold on.
Well, going off of the banking model, if you just received what the teacher said and simply complied, then that would be oppressive, right? So wouldn't we be aiming for something that's adaptive and transformative then?
I agree with that. Oh, Stan, you have to redo it all
Do
again.
I have to say that again?
Yeah.
So going off of the banking model, if we just complied with what the teacher said, that would be oppressive. And under the Freirian idea, we'd be aiming for something that's both adaptive and transformative.
Right. And so that's pushing in the mere adaptive move and not pushing that transformative move as well. Absolutely. So it's cutting that process in half. Yeah.
If I understand what you're saying correctly, to, I guess, model this super Y perspective on reading, you would, like, for example, like you would take, how would you apply this? Like, being, would I write it? Would I, annotate it? Would that be, or just having the more mental context to reading in terms of using it, in your mind, applying it to your problems?
So,
So I guess the comment would be on the application of this super Y.
right, and this goes to, I mean, the part I gotta be really up forward on is, first off, the whole drive for this started with question that I didn't know what to say to. And so I was really thinking through as I was writing this paper and trying to make sense of it. And I didn't get to the last part until I hit the problem, and then it kind of started working through the problem. And the palimpsest move, once I saw, it was Danielle Caprellian and Brian Young, really the librarian and English teachers, that pointed me in that direction of the palimpsest that really helped me see, like, oh, that's what Super Y is doing. At first I just saw Super Y and I was like, Super Y is doing something weird that, like, I haven't seen that move before. And and I didn't know what it was doing, but it was changing the text. And so from that Superwisian framework, it's literally like writing over the text. And I think as academics, a lot of time you see, like there's this one philosopher, Martin Heidegger, and they have Xerox photos of his, of books he's checked out from libraries. He made librarians mad. Because like the book, he'd just cross out stuff and write over the top of it. And that's doing that palimpsest move. Do not write over stuff in the library. But that's doing the palimpsest move. I think as a lot of academics, as writing happens, there's writing and rewriting, and that happens. I think, notes and margins is one clear way of doing it. Even this show, I believe, so it starts off showing George scares the dragon. I'm sorry, the dragon scares George. But in the original, I think it's a retelling of the parable of Saint George and the dragon. I don't think there's any indication of the dragon scaring George. It's just George goes out and slays a dragon. And so even in that move, there's a palimpsest going on, and there's a rewriting of the script. I think the problem that we encounter today is really, in a way, it's textbook reading. So with textbook reading, we think like there's the bold print, and that's the fixed definition, and nothing's left to change. It's all there. It's done. It's over. And so the question is kind of, there's a two-part issue, which is, your question is kind of, my answer is I don't know. And that's the end of the paper. What I want to go into is figure out, is Super Y doing a model for reading, which is one model among minis, or in some deeper sense, do we read in a palimpsest way? In which case, you know, in what way does it look like? You know, I think minimally, you know, writing over, taking notes is one minimal way, but then is the process of rethinking and retelling and discussing the story we're reading or the book we're reading, in a sense, we're rewriting as we discuss, so there's the verbal text going on, in which case, if the answer is Super Y is just describing what we do in an authentic way, then all of those would, I think, be instances of palimpsest and reading. But I'm stepping on a turf that I just don't know well, which is why I'm terrified there are English people in here, because that's their turf. The literary theory is English turf. In philosophy, there's ways into literary theory, crystal clear, but that's not a direction I've really gone into much. So I'm really just kind of charting new turf for myself on this. Good question, though. Any others?
Emojis seemed. I just lost it. No, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm just thinking that as you're talking, Matthew, there's this idea that maybe like emojis are an attempt to control the message even more by the sender, right? Like, you have to feel funny about this or something. And then there's that interlocutor you were talking about, like there's time, right? With text messages, you're supposed to answer quickly. I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. What do you think about like applications to modern?
Well, so I know one of the discussions with the literary theory has to do with I think photography comes in, where photography almost makes this move at attempting to do a one-to-one correspondence between meaning and message, and so and then of course that's I was just reading this piece on Bart, or maybe it was by Bart. That was analyzing a photograph and talking about the multiple layers of meaning within that. And so the emoji, though, I think is trying to get at a one-to-one correspondence, right? So hashtag frowny face is really I am sad, and that's all it can mean. I know you're not supposed to say hashtag before frowny face, but that's my palimpsest on the frowny face. So, but I think an emoji is trying to make that one-to-one correspondence. And in a sense, it is trying to, one sense, you know, it is trying to get to the very direct sadness. And then that is the only interpretation. So it is kind of pushing into maybe this authorial intent model in saying there is one interpretation. Unless you can play with emojis. Does anybody, you're all young and deal with emojis. Do you play with emojis, like where an emoji has multiple meanings in it? Or is it kind of like whenever I say frowny face, I mean I'm sad? Are there emoji puns? What's an example of an emoji pun? Or an emoji that you're playing with the meaning on? Does anybody have one? You've got one. Okay, so you're being ironic with the emoji. So sarcasm, irony. So there's two moves with the emoji. My nemesis stubs my nemesis's toe, and I do emoji cry face when I really mean emoji smiley face. Yeah, okay. All right. But I do think it pushes in that direction. I think emojis probably, to me, push the same challenge that as photography was coming out, emojis doing that same type of push. And then I don't know, I guess you could have like Duchamp, a contemporary Banksy come out and just do like an emoji toilet on a wall, and that's. But Duchamp did this like to challenge the artists. There was like the Academy would say, like, here's who gets to put their art up. And then all these people got together and were like, no, we get to choose what's good art. It's, you know, we're not gonna have this Academy decide. So Duchamp was like, throws a toilet on a wall and is like, okay, there's my art. Which is really making a powerful message of like, let's see how far we can push this. At least that's my understanding of that piece. So maybe there can be an emoji version of that. Any others? All right, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate your sitting through this. Take care.